Today, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails declared a one-day fast in solidarity with 4 prisoners who have been on an extended hunger strike. This has fueled protest against the Israeli government throughout the occupied West Bank. But one man in particular, Samer Isawi, is at the center of much of the attention. He's been refusing food for 200 days in protest of Israel's policy of administrative detention, which allows authorities to detain Palestinians without charge or trial indefinitely. Today marks the 3rd time he appeared in court to try to get out on bail. And again, a Jerusalem judge rejected his request. Meanwhile, Israeli police staged an overnight raid on Isawi's family home in East Jerusalem, arresting his brother Shadi. Joining us to discuss this is Youssef Munayir, Executive Director of the Palestine Center. Youssef, Isawi and some of the other long-term prisoners were released in October 2011 under the prisoner swap deal, where more than 1,000 Palestinians were released in exchange for captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit. So why were they rearrested, and what were the terms of the agreement that they violated, as you understand it? Unfortunately, Youssef, you're actually muted. If you could unmute yourself, there you go, in the top right, we'd appreciate it. There's a little microphone button. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, the terms of the agreement, that's a very interesting question, of course. You know, the terms of the agreement was never really published. It's not really clear what it was for specific prisoners. In this particular prisoner's case, he happens to be from Jerusalem. The agreement that he was pressured to sign on to reportedly said that he agreed to remain within the boundaries of municipal Jerusalem, which of course includes the east and west half of the Jerusalem municipality that Israel annexed after 1967. The Israelis claim that he left the municipality even though he denies that he believes he was within the municipality. Nonetheless, they've rearrested him under this policy of administrative detention, which essentially means they can hold you without charge indefinitely. And they currently have over 180 prisoners, about 180 prisoners under this administrative detention policy. In resistance to this policy and an objection to it, he has undertaken now a hunger strike that has gone on for some 200 plus days, where he's refused food and of course has grown increasingly emaciated and is in serious risk for catastrophic health problems at this point.
Well, Youssef, as a result of you know, his hunger strike and his worsening condition, many people fearing he's near death, we saw the United Nations has called on Israel to end this policy of administrative detention, as it's called. And Navi Pillay, the UN High Commissioner, actually said in response, persons detained must be charged and face trial with judicial guarantees in accordance with international standards or be promptly released. Perhaps it's an overreaching question, but why then does this policy continue time and time again, despite human rights organizations and the United Nations very clearly demanding an end to it?
Well, it continues because the Israelis have been able to get away with it really without repercussions or cost. You know, international law is one of those very important norms and principles that many states should comply with, and we would hope that they comply with, but unless there is enforcement of those principles, it's not going to happen. And of course, as with administrative detention and other facets of the Israeli occupation, which has been going on now for several decades on end, it's continued unabated because the Israelis have not faced costs for that occupation. And you know, continue to be defended primarily by the United States when there is international criticism of these policies. You know, administrative detention in particular has become a very clear tool that the Israelis are using in the occupied territories precisely for the purpose of political repression. They're rounding up people that they cannot necessarily convict in a court of law, and using this policy of administrative detention to keep them behind bars indefinitely. And they've done so, in this case, against the Isawi family in a very punitive fashion, and have punished many different members of the family as well. It's not just Samer who's on the hunger strike, but also his brothers who have been imprisoned, his brothers who have had their houses demolished, and other members of his family that have been killed So, it's an extensive policy, punitive policy that targets Palestinians in a multiplicity of dimensions. Administrative detention is just one of them.
Right. Well, I want to bring in the community. Brian, we didn't speak to you earlier when we were talking about the prior story. Your thoughts on
Right.
this story?
You know what? We as a nation, the United States uses the same policy. That's for all those prisoners down in Guantanamo Bay. Same scenario, really. We use it. We put those people down there. We never charge them with anything, and those guys have been in there for years. I don't necessarily agree with the policy. At the same time, I don't think the UN has the authority to tell Israel, how they handle their security issues, because the security issues there in Israel are much different than the security issues here in the United States.
And so you think that perhaps then certain universal applications of due process shouldn't necessarily apply in Israel, even though you're saying in the U.S. they don't apply?
Well, I think morally they should apply, but I don't think any entity has, the right to tell Israel or the United States how to handle its own security. I mean, the UN has never told us to give up Guantanamo Bay. I'm sure they suggest it. But, it's still there, even though Obama said he was going to get rid of it.
Right.
4 years later, we're still holding people there.
Well, you make a very good point. I mean, I see that, Jewel, you're nodding your head. It seems as though whether there's condemnations or the UN passes resolutions about Israel or the U.S., whether it comes to Gitmo, with the lack of any sort of authority, it seems as though Israel and the U.S., but since we're talking about Israel, can continue to act in defiance of these laws and recommendations by the UN.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that was my first thought of that. It sounds exactly like Guantanamo. And I think that the practice is wrong, and we need to figure out a way. I don't know if it's a universal law or just some sort of agreement, but I did feel the same way. We're not in a position to point our finger right now because we're doing exactly the same thing.
Yusuf, you mentioned the United States being, perhaps an enabler of this process, and now we're pointing to certain similarities in terms of indefinite detention or detention without due process. I know you live here in the U.S. Do you see these similarities, Yusuf, and perhaps how might we resolve this with the UN or in absence of the UN?
Well, there are certainly some similarities with the situation here in the United States and Guantanamo Bay, but it's not exactly the same thing. The laws that govern what happens in the West Bank or are supposed to apply are really the laws relating to military occupation. And the indefinite detention or detention without charge is permitted under international law in these cases, but only when there's very specific and imminent security threat that can be determined. What's become clear, and a number of different human rights organizations have documented this with the Israeli practice of administrative detention, is that it is not being used for the purposes of security, but rather become a tool of political repression, because these sentences are being extended indefinitely with no charges being brought against people. And after they are released, they're often rounded up again. So the point here is quite clear. If the person, in fact, is guilty or something or can be charged of something, then charge them. And if not, then let them go. Again, in Guantanamo, we have a different situation where we're talking about because this is a conflict not only with the international dimension, but also with the constitutional dimension in the United States as it relates to habeas corpus. So they're similar, but they're also different. And I think it's very clear in the Israeli case when it comes to administrative detention that the principles of the law are being violated by the way it's being put in practice.
Well, yes, certainly, and there are distinctions. I do want to point out, though, when it comes to the practical matters that are unfolding on the ground, we've seen that many people are worried about where this might lead, not just for Samer Essawi, but also the conflict and the tensions on the ground in the West Bank. We've seen thousands protesting. If you take my screen, these are some of the images taken by activists that have been circulating online. This is one. We've seen people gathering in the northern city of Nablus. This is also in Hebron. We've seen there's his photo right there. And even in Gaza, this is at the UNDP, I believe, their headquarters in Gaza. We see women showing solidarity there with protesters, but it's also spreading. This is Shaima Abu Bakr showing a demonstration in northern Spain just a few hours ago. Of course, it's small. But my question then, Yusuf, is there's concerns from the family, obviously, about his health, but many people say that the Israeli government will not allow him to die out of fear of the consequences, perhaps even, provocations of a third intifada. What do you think will happen and should happen?
Well, I think, the Israeli government is concerned about what may happen if there is a response to his death. God forbid that happens in Israeli custody. And they will try to mitigate that to the extent possible. They have shown in the past their inability to deal with these forms of Palestinian nonviolent resistance, and have ultimately found ways to make deals with some of the hunger striking prisoners. The reality is that military occupation, which is what Israel practices over the occupied Palestinian territories, does not do Gandhi well, as one of the former leaders of the Israeli security establishment stated. They cannot handle Palestinian nonviolent resistance well, and as you rightly pointed out, the optics of that are particularly damaging for a state that claims to be a beacon of democracy or what have you. The reality is that these types of nonviolent resistance are precisely the types of resistance to occupation that so many have called for in the past. And the question I think we need to be asking now is, when these voices, when these actions of nonviolent resistance are repressed, where are those in the Western world who have been demanding this nonviolent resistance to stand up and say, we condemn Israeli repression of this nonviolent dissent? That's what we need today.
And that's certainly a question that many people are, and I would argue, should be asking. Denise, before we move on to the next story, do you have anything to add? Denise, are you with us?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I would echo a lot of what's been said, and mostly I'm left with the question of, what do we think the role of the UN should be here? Because I disagree to say that they have no role at all. At the same time, we've seen over and over that simply having them call on a country to do something doesn't necessarily get us anywhere. So, I would hope that the UN would have a voice in the conversation, but that it would be an effective voice.
All right, I would agree with you, and this conversation certainly doesn't end here. And I just want to point out, this is a photo tweeted from an account, Samer Isawi 1. There is Samet in the middle, and his brother, who Shadi, was recently arrested, on the right. Of course, this story lives online with the hashtag Samer Isawi for those of you interested in following it. Yusuf, thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you in the Hangout, stick around. We have more stories coming up here at HuffPost Live.